So what is self-assessment in the context of developing a negotiation strategy? All right, we've talked about before what goes into a negotiation strategy, being your orientation, your strategic objectives, and your tactics for carrying out those objectives. Okay, but in a prior video, we've also addressed the need for a certain level of understanding, for a certain level of information before you should or could proceed in developing a negotiation strategy. And of those, it's all about assessment. You're assessing different things: yourself, the counterparty, the context of the situation, and then the social context at play. So that being said, we're going to start by addressing what does it mean to do a self-assessment in a negotiation or as part of a negotiation strategy. So to start with, you're identifying the interests at stake or that matter to you, whether those are substantive interests or procedural interests, whatever matters. Now, lots of times, particularly in distributive negotiations, you have one primary interest that you are negotiating, but there are other secondary interests at stake, and those interests are incredibly important as well. Why? Because they can affect other aspects of the negotiation. They can influence you in terms of what you're willing to accept, right? Oftentimes, what we'll talk about in a minute, your alternatives or your best alternative, right, to working out a negotiated agreement, that's not the point at which you'll walk away from the negotiation. Why? Because there are other interests at stake, whether coming to an agreement now is more important, the certainty of not having to look further in the future, just ease of mind. All of these are interests that they're not the heart of what you're negotiating for, but they matter to you. So that would change what your walkaway point or your reservation point is, right? So with that being said, all of the interest, anything that matters to you as part of a negotiation should be identified, right? Whether it's the substantive interest, whether it's procedural interest, whether they're secondary in nature or however minor, it's important to identify them, to understand that ahead of time. Next, your alternatives. What alternatives exist to you working out a negotiated agreement with the other party? If the negotiation fails, if you cannot come to an agreement, what is your best alternative? Okay? Among whatever alternatives exist. Sometimes you only have one alternative, and that is your best alternative, right? So that will help inform at what point in time you say, well, okay, the negotiation has failed. I can't achieve this, so I'm going to walk away. And that position is known as your reservation point. Okay? At what point you're willing to walk away if you can't achieve at least that you will go with one of your alternatives. Now, I caution you, your walkaway point is not always exactly even with your best alternative. Why? Because there could be interests at stake that make you willing to accept something less than you could pursue as an alternative, right? And again, that's going to be based on you and the situation, right? So anyway, that's your reservation point. And your reservation point, it is so important to establish that up front, because going into a negotiation, if you don't have a strong understanding of what is your reservation point and at what point you are willing to walk away, you are more prone to make emotional decisions that are not based upon sound reasoning and logic. The type of reasoning and logic that you can do and undertake outside of the emotional influences of the negotiation. You can make these decisions, establish these boundaries in advance, okay? And then there's your target point. Your target point is to what you are aspiring in the negotiation. It is what you are going for, okay? Generally, that is somewhere very close to where you anchor or where you open up the negotiation, right? It needs to be realistic. So oftentimes you'll anchor above your target point, understanding that you're going to come down to it, as long as it's still potentially realistic and not going to have the negative effect of alienating the other party. But again, your target point is what you reasonably believe you could achieve in this negotiation. I will tell you this, research shows as well that focusing on your target point, what you believe you could achieve, rather than focusing on your reservation point, what you might, what you would at what position you'd walk away or at what point you'd walk away the negotiation, focusing on that target rather than your walk away point, right? Focusing on the higher results in better outcomes for you. Okay, so keep that in mind. And then lastly, estimate your risk propensity. Well, risk is a probability of an outcome. A probability of an outcome you don't prefer, or negative outcome, right? And so the actual risk of a situation, believe it or not, is generally established, right? But your perception of risk is different. How much risk you perceive is there, okay? So risk propensity is your willingness to undertake an action or to go for something or to seek something out that could result in a negative outcome, right? So in assessing your risk propensity, you're saying, okay, this is how much risk I perceive is there. I may be wrong, but this is how much risk I perceive is there in this negotiation. Okay, it could be far more risky or it could be far less. But based upon what I perceive, I'm willing to risk losing this. Okay, I'm willing to risk this deal going south at this, to this extent. That type of thing. So to the extent you're willing to accept whatever potential negative outcomes you see as a possibility is your risk of propensity. So taken together, if you can assess these about yourself, you have the information to start the strategic planning process. Interests, alternatives, your resistance point, your target point, and your individual risk propensity.